The first sound you hear is a slap. Not the physical kind, but the type that hits your soul. "Grace, no daughter of mine will marry that man!" Evelyn screamed, her voice breaking with desperation as tears rolled down her cheeks. "Open your eyes before it's too late." Grace was silent, her hands trembling as she stood in her mother's small, modest kitchen. The aroma of fried plantain hung in the air, but her appetite was long gone. Her mother's words cut deep, but her heart told her something else. "Mama, I love him," Grace finally whispered, her voice shaky but firm. "James has potential. He just needs someone to believe in him." Evelyn slammed her hand on the wooden counter. "Potential? Love?" she scoffed. "Love won't feed you when he spends your last naira on things that don't matter. Love won't protect you when he leaves you stranded with debts you didn't create." But Grace wouldn't hear it. She had already made up her mind, blinded by love and the promises James whispered into her ears on quiet nights. Her elder brother, Michael, stood in the corner, arms crossed, shaking his head. "Grace," he said calmly but firmly, "you're rushing into something you don't fully understand. I've seen the way he talks to you, the way he acts like you owe him everything. This isn't love." Grace's voice rose, defensive. "You don't know him like I do. He's just under pressure. He's trying to make something of himself, but society keeps pulling him down." Evelyn sobbed quietly in the corner, clutching her wrapper as though it could shield her from the storm brewing in her family. Michael gave up, storming out of the room, leaving Grace and her mother alone. And in that moment, Grace chose. She ignored the warnings. She thought love would conquer all. She thought her sacrifices would turn James into the man she believed he could be. She couldn't have been more wrong. James was charming, no doubt. His smile could melt an ice block in Harmattan. Grace first met him at her friend Anita's wedding, where he played the role of the funny, easygoing groomsman. He had this way of making her feel seen, like she was the only woman in the room. He painted vivid pictures of their future together, a big house, thriving businesses, and 3 beautiful kids who would never know lack. But beneath the charm, there were cracks in the facade. "Babe, can you lend me 100,000 naira? My car needs urgent repairs," he asked one evening. Grace didn't think twice. She sent the money without hesitation, even though it meant skipping lunch for the next week. It wasn't the first time. Soon, James' urgent needs became a pattern. First, it was his car. Then, he needed help with rent because business was slow. Grace dipped into her savings over and over again, convincing herself that love meant sacrifice. Her mother noticed the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of stress. "You're the one working hard while he's sitting back and making excuses," Evelyn warned again. But Grace was too far gone, lost in the illusion James had created. When James proposed, it wasn't the fairy tale Grace had always dreamed of. He didn't get down on one knee or present a sparkling diamond ring. Instead, he casually said, "We should just get married. I mean, we're already like a couple. So why not make it official?" Grace's heart fluttered, even though deep down, a small voice whispered, "This isn't right." Her family begged her to reconsider. Her mother cried again, and Michael threatened to cut ties with her if she went through with the marriage. But Grace didn't listen. "James is my future," she told herself, ignoring the uneasy feeling in her stomach. Their wedding was a simple ceremony held at a local church. Grace wore a second-hand gown she bought at a popular local market. James showed up late, claiming he had been stuck in traffic. "Na wa-oh," Michael muttered under his breath, as he watched James stroll into the church like he was attending a casual hangout. Grace ignored the murmurs from the small crowd of guests. All she saw was James, smiling at her like she was his entire world. She convinced herself it was enough. But as she walked down the aisle, she caught a glimpse of her mother's face. Evelyn's eyes were red and swollen, her lips moving in silent prayer. Grace didn't know it then, but that prayer would become her lifeline in the months to come. Grace had always dreamed of a honeymoon getaway, a week by the beach or even a quiet lodge where they could bask in the glow of their new life. But James had other plans. Why waste money on a honeymoon when we could invest it in my business? He said, his tone so casual it felt like a logical suggestion. Grace hesitated but eventually agreed, as she always did. Okay, love. You're right, she said, forcing a smile. Their honeymoon turned out to be a quiet week at home, during which James spent most of his time on his phone or out meeting business partners. Grace stayed alone, cleaning, cooking, and convincing herself that the sacrifice would be worth it. But the sacrifices had only just begun. 3 months into the marriage, Grace began to notice things that didn't add up. James had told her he was working on a major contract that would bring in millions, yet he was always borrowing money from her for fuel and small logistics. One night, Grace came across an unopened letter on the dining table. It was from a bank, warning of overdue loan payments. James, what's this? She asked cautiously, holding the letter out to him. He snatched it from her hands, laughing nervously. Oh, that? It's nothing serious. Just a mix-up with the bank. I'll handle it. But Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When she tried to bring it up again, James snapped. Why are you always doubting me? Don't you trust your husband? The word stung, and Grace apologized immediately, blaming herself for questioning him. The first slap came out of nowhere. Grace had asked James about the money she lent him 2 weeks earlier. When will you return it? I need to pay for Mama's hospital bills, she said softly. James froze, his face darkening. Is it because of small money you're talking to me like this? He barked. Before Grace could respond, his hand connected with her cheek. The sting was immediate, and her vision blurred with tears. Don't ever disrespect me like that again, James muttered, storming out of the room. Grace sat on the cold floor, her hand pressed to her throbbing cheek. She wanted to run, to call her mother, but her pride held her back. He didn't mean it, she whispered to herself. He's just under a lot of stress. That night, Grace's phone buzzed. It was Michael. How's the perfect marriage going? He asked, sarcasm dripping from his voice. Grace hesitated, swallowing the lump in her throat. We're fine, she lied. Michael sighed deeply. Grace, you're my sister. I know when something isn't right. Talk to me. Tears streamed down her face, but she forced herself to stay silent. I'm okay, Michael. Really? He didn't believe her but decided not to push. Just remember, the door is always open if you need to come home. But Grace wasn't ready to admit defeat, not yet. Evelyn could feel it in her bones. Something was wrong. She showed up unannounced one morning, carrying a basket of fresh fruits and a warm pot of egusi soup. Grace opened the door, her face pale and her movements stiff. Evelyn noticed the faint bruise on her daughter's cheek but said nothing, yet. Where's your husband? Evelyn asked as she set the basket down on the kitchen counter. He's out, Grace replied quickly, avoiding her mother's piercing gaze. Evelyn reached out, gently touching Grace's face. My child, are you okay? Grace's resolve broke for a moment, and she nearly collapsed into her mother's arms. But then she remembered James' warning. Don't you dare tell anyone about our private matters, he had said. So Grace forced a smile. I'm fine, Mama. Just tired. But Evelyn wasn't convinced, but she decided not to press further. James' financial demands became relentless. He started taking control of Grace's small salary, claiming it was our money. We're married now, he said one evening, stuffing cash into his wallet. No need for separate accounts. Grace didn't argue, though her heart sank as she watched her savings disappear. One night, she overheard him on a phone call, laughing and making promises to someone about a big party he was planning. When she confronted him, he waved her off. You worry too much, Grace. Everything is under control. But everything was far from under control. It all came crashing down one fateful evening. Grace returned home early from work to find James with another woman in their living room. The woman was lounging on the couch, sipping wine like she owned the place. Who is this? Grace demanded, her voice trembling. James didn't even flinch. "She's my business partner," he said casually, but the smug look on the woman's face told a different story. Grace's heart shattered, but before she could react, James grabbed her arm and dragged her into the bedroom. "Don't embarrass me," he hissed, his grip tightening. "You'll ruin everything." Grace pulled away, tears streaming down her face. "James, you've already ruined me." That night, Grace lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her chest heavy with anger and heartbreak. James slept soundly beside her, as though nothing had happened. The words her mother and brother had said months ago rang in her ears. "You'll regret it, Grace." But instead of packing her things and leaving, Grace stayed. She convinced herself there had to be an explanation, a way to salvage what was left of her marriage. The next morning, James acted as if nothing had happened. He even kissed her on the cheek before leaving for business meetings. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. "I can't keep living like this," she whispered to herself. Later that day at noon, Evelyn showed up at Grace's doorstep again, this time uninvited. "You've lost so much weight," Evelyn said, her eyes scanning Grace's tired face and frail figure. "I'm fine, Mama," Grace replied, forcing a smile. Evelyn wasn't having it. "Don't lie to me, Grace. What's going on in this house? Has he been hurting you?" Grace hesitated, tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted to spill everything, to scream about the emotional and financial abuse, the infidelity, and the endless cycle of disappointment. But she shook her head. "It's nothing I can't handle." Evelyn grabbed her daughter's hands, her voice breaking. "Grace, I beg you in the name of God, leave this marriage. Come home. We'll figure it out together." Grace pulled her hands away, her heart aching but her pride still intact. "I can't, Mama. I made a vow." Evelyn left, her shoulders sagging with the weight of helplessness. Days turned into weeks, and things only got worse. James stopped coming home some nights, claiming he was too busy to return. When Grace tried to question him, he would either yell or ignore her completely. One evening, she found herself scrolling through old pictures on her phone, photos of happier times before James. Before the broken promises. Before the bruises. Her fingers hovered over Michael's number. She wanted to call him, to hear his voice, to feel the comfort of someone who cared. But she didn't. Instead, she sat alone in the dark, wondering how her life had come to this. The breaking point came one stormy night. James came home drunk, reeking of alcohol and perfume. "Where have you been?" Grace asked, her voice trembling. "Don't start with me, Grace," he slurred, stumbling into the living room. "You've been out drinking while I've been here, working and trying to save this marriage." James turned on her, his eyes blazing with anger. "Save this marriage? You think you're better than me, don't you? Always acting like a saint when you're nothing but a burden." The words hit Grace like a slap, but what followed was far worse. Before she could react, James shoved her against the wall. The impact knocked the air out of her lungs, and she crumpled to the floor. As he loomed over her, shouting insults, Grace's vision blurred. All she could hear was her mother's voice in her head, "Come home before it's too late." Grace woke up the next morning to find James gone. Her body ached, and her face was swollen, but her mind was clearer than it had been in months. She packed a small bag, stuffing in whatever clothes she could grab. She didn't care where she went, as long as it was far away from James. Grace made one phone call, to Michael. "Come and get me," she whispered, her voice breaking. Michael arrived within minutes, his car screeching to a halt outside her house. He took one look at her bruised face and clenched his fists. "If I see that man, I swear, just take me home," Grace interrupted, her voice weak. Michael helped her into the car, and as they drove away, Grace felt a weight lifting off her shoulders. Evelyn cried when she saw her daughter, pulling her into a tight embrace. "My child, why didn't you listen to me?" Grace sobbed into her mother's arms, finally letting out all the pain she had bottled up for so long. For weeks, she stayed with her family, trying to rebuild her life. But James wasn't done with her yet. He showed up at her family's house one evening, demanding to see her. "Grace is my wife," he shouted, banging on the gate. Michael came out, his expression cold. "She's not your punching bag. Get out before I call the police." James left, but Grace knew it wasn't over. With Michael's support, Grace filed for a restraining order against James. She also began the process of filing for a divorce, though it was one of the hardest decisions she had ever made. James tried to fight back, spreading lies about Grace to anyone who would listen. He claimed she had been the one who ruined the marriage, painting himself as the victim. But Grace didn't care anymore. She was done being the silent, obedient wife. As word spread about Grace's decision to leave her husband, the reactions were mixed. Some neighbors whispered behind her back, calling her a failure. She couldn't keep her home, they said. Others, especially women who had suffered in silence in their marriages, secretly admired her courage, but were too afraid to say it out loud. Even some family members tried to talk her out of the divorce. "Grace, think about your future," Annette said during a family meeting. "No man will want to marry a divorced woman." Grace's mother stood firm. "If staying married means my daughter has to die, then let her remain single forever," Evelyn said, silencing everyone in the room. For the first time in a long while, Grace felt a small spark of hope. James wasn't taking the divorce lightly. He began showing up uninvited at Grace's workplace, causing scenes and threatening her in front of her colleagues. "You think you can leave me and embarrass me like this?" he shouted one afternoon, his voice echoing through the office. Grace's boss called her into his office afterward. "Grace, I understand what you're going through, but this can't continue. It's affecting the office environment." Humiliated and scared, Grace broke down in tears. She realized she needed more protection. With Michael's help, she reported James to the police, who warned him to stay away. But she knew that James wouldn't back down so easily. Despite the chaos, Grace began to rebuild her life. She started attending therapy sessions, where she slowly opened up about the abuse she had endured. Each session felt like peeling away layers of pain. But it was also a step toward healing. Grace also reconnected with old friends she had pushed away during her marriage. They welcomed her back with open arms, offering her the support she desperately needed. Her mother and brother continued to be her pillars of strength. Michael even helped her find a lawyer who would handle her divorce case pro bono. But deep down, Grace knew that her healing journey was far from over. One evening, while Grace was cleaning out her belongings, she stumbled upon an old notebook. Inside were pages of her dreams and goals from years ago, before James. She flipped through the pages, tears streaming down her face. She had wanted to start a catering business, to travel, to make a difference in the lives of others. "I let him steal my dreams," she whispered. That night, Grace made a decision. She would no longer be a victim. She would take back control of her life. Grace began working on her catering business idea, starting small with orders from friends and neighbors. Her first big break came when she was hired to cater a wedding. As she watched guests enjoy her food and compliment her work, she felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in a long while, Grace felt proud of herself. Her business grew steadily, and with each success, she felt stronger and more confident. James resurfaced months later, this time begging for forgiveness. "Grace, I've changed," he said, kneeling before her at her mother's house. "I was stupid and ungrateful. Please give me another chance." Grace stared at him, her heart racing. There had been a time when she would have jumped at the chance to hear those words. But now, all she felt was anger and sadness. "You didn't just hurt me, James," she said, her voice steady. "You broke me. And I won't let you do it again." James left, defeated. Grace felt a weight lift off her shoulders. For the first time, she truly felt free. Months had passed since Grace took the bold step of ending her toxic marriage. Her journey to healing and self-discovery wasn't easy, but every step she took brought her closer to the person she was always meant to be. Her catering business had not only become a source of income but also a source of pride and fulfillment. She was no longer the timid woman living in Jane's shadow. Instead, she was a strong, independent woman who had reclaimed her identity. Grace's reputation as a caterer grew beyond her local community. She began receiving orders from high-profile clients, including politicians and celebrities. Her social media pages were flooded with praise and recommendations. And she was finally living the dream she had once written down in her old notebook. One day, as she was preparing for a large wedding order, her mother walked into the kitchen. Evelyn watched her daughter with a proud smile. "Look at you, Grace," Evelyn said, her voice filled with emotion. "Do you see now why I was so hard on you? Why I begged you to leave him?" Grace paused, wiping her hands on her apron. She turned to her mother, tears welling up in her eyes. "Mama, you saved me," she said, her voice breaking. "If not for you and Michael, I don't know where I'd be today." Evelyn embraced her daughter tightly. "You saved yourself, my child. You found your strength, and you fought your way back. That's what matters." Grace's story didn't just inspire her family, it inspired her community. She began receiving messages from women who were stuck in abusive relationships, asking for advice and encouragement. Rather than turning them away, Grace decided to do something meaningful. She started a support group for women, providing them with a safe space to share their stories and find solutions. She even began offering free catering classes to women who wanted to gain financial independence. Her journey became a beacon of hope for others. People began to see her not just as a successful caterer but as a survivor, a role model, and a leader. One day, Grace received an unexpected visitor. It was James. He looked older, tired, and defeated. "I heard about your success," he said, standing awkwardly at the doorstep. "You've done well for yourself." Grace crossed her arms, her expression neutral. "What do you want, James?" "I just came to say." "I'm sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "I was wrong. I was selfish and cruel. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it." Grace studied him for a moment. She didn't feel anger or hatred anymore. Instead, she felt pity. "I forgive you, James," she said softly. "Not for your sake, but for mine. I've moved on, and I'm not carrying the weight of your mistakes anymore." James nodded, his eyes glistening with tears. He left without another word, and Grace closed the door, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. Grace stood in her garden that evening, watching the sunset. Her life was far from perfect, but it was hers, and that was enough. She thought about all the lessons she had learned. The power of self-worth. She learned to value herself and never settle for less than she deserved. The strength of family. Her mother and brother's unwavering support reminded her of the importance of love and loyalty. The danger of ignoring red flags. She realized that love isn't enough to sustain a relationship built on lies and abuse. The beauty of second chances. Life had given her a second chance to rebuild and thrive, and she had embraced it fully. Dear viewers, Grace's story is a reminder that no matter how dark things may seem, there is always hope for a brighter tomorrow. If you've been inspired by Grace's journey, like and share this story with someone who might need it. And if you're going through a tough time, remember that you're stronger than you think. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or experiences. Let's inspire each other to make better decisions and live our best lives.